The message was spray-painted across the police station wall in blood-red letters. "This city belongs to U.S. now." Detective David Tank Rodriguez stood in the parking lot at 6 a.m., reading the words that had appeared overnight while sipping his black coffee. The Torrino crime family had been making moves for months, but this was their boldest statement yet. By noon, 3 more cops had requested transfers to different precincts. By evening, the police chief was talking about strategic withdrawal from certain neighborhoods. But Tank just crumpled his empty coffee cup, walked into the station, and did something that would either save the city or get him killed. He opened his desk drawer, pulled out a thick manila folder marked Torrino Family Confidential, and began making phone calls that would declare war on the most dangerous criminal organization the city had ever seen. Because sometimes one cop with nothing left to lose is more dangerous than an entire army. Welcome to those who left a trace. Before we dive into this incredible story of one man's war against organized crime, tell me in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today? And if you believe that sometimes it takes just one person to stand up against injustice, hit that subscribe button to support stories of courage that inspire us all. Detective David Rodriguez had earned his nickname Tank during his 3rd year on the force when he walked into a hostage situation that had the SWAT team stumped and ended it by simply kicking down the door and tackling the gunman before anyone could react. At 6'2" and 240 pounds of muscle earned through decades of police work and military service, Tank moved through the world with the quiet confidence of someone who had never backed down from a fight he believed was worth having. The 14th precinct sat in the heart of what had once been a thriving working-class neighborhood. But over the past 2 years, legitimate businesses have been systematically replaced by fronts for the Torrino crime family's operations. Pizza shops that never seemed to serve customers, laundromats that launder more than clothes, and social clubs where old men played cards while millions of dollars in drug money changed hands. Tank had been watching the transformation with growing frustration, filing reports that disappeared into bureaucratic black holes, and requesting resources that never materialized. The Torrino family operated with the kind of sophisticated organization that made traditional police work nearly impossible, insulating their leadership behind layers of legitimate businesses and carefully maintained legal barriers. Vinny the Fish Torrino had inherited the family operations from his father 3 years earlier and had immediately begun expanding their influence beyond the traditional boundaries that previous crime bosses had respected. Unlike the old-school mobsters who understood the value of maintaining peaceful coexistence with law enforcement, Vinny viewed the police as just another obstacle to be removed through intimidation, corruption, or violence. The morning Tank found a graffiti message on the station wall. He had already been investigating 3 unsolved murders that he suspected were connected to the Torrino family's expansion efforts. Small-time drug dealers who had refused to work for the family, a shop owner who had declined to pay protection money, and a city councilman who had been asking uncomfortable questions about certain construction contracts. Captain Patricia Mills had called Tank into her office the previous week to discuss what she diplomatically termed the evolving situation in the neighborhood. Tank. Captain Mills had said, her expression weary, "I'm getting pressure from downtown to reassign resources away from organized crime investigation. The brass thinks we're not getting enough return on our investment." Tank had sat across from her desk, his jaw tight with frustration. "Captain, with respect, that's exactly what the Torrino family wants. They're counting on us to give up and let them operate freely." Mills had nodded, but her response indicated the political realities that constrain police operations. "Tank, I understand your concerns, but we have limited manpower and budget constraints. The city council is asking for more visible patrol presence and faster response times to 911 calls." Tank had understood the subtext. Investigating sophisticated organized crime operations required time, resources, and specialized expertise that the department couldn't afford, while politicians wanted police activities that voters could see and appreciate. "Captain, if we don't stop the Torrino family now, while they're still consolidating power, we'll never be able to control them once they're fully established." Mills had looked out her office window at the neighborhood streets where legitimate businesses were closing daily while criminal enterprises flourished. Tank, I'm not disagreeing with your assessment, but I need you to understand the constraints we're operating under. That conversation had taken place 5 days before the graffiti message appeared on the station wall. Tank spent his morning shift driving through the neighborhood, noting the changes that had accelerated over the past month. The hardware store that had served the community for 40 years was now boarded up, while a new social club had opened in the building next door. The family restaurant where Tank had eaten lunch for 3 years was closed, but the building now housed a check-cashing operation that seemed to process an unusual volume of large transactions. At noon, Tank received a call that would crystallize his decision to take action regardless of official department policy. Detective Rodriguez. The voice was elderly and shaky. This is Mrs. Elena Vasquez. I live on Maple Street. Could you come see me? I have information about what's happening in the neighborhood. Tank knew Mrs. Vasquez as a 73-year-old widow who had lived in the same house for 50 years and knew everyone in the community. If she was calling the police directly, the situation was serious. Tank found Mrs. Vasquez waiting for him on her front porch, her hands nervously clutching a manila envelope. The house next door, which had been occupied by the Martinez family for decades, now had bars on the windows and men in expensive suits coming and going at all hours. Detective Rodriguez, Mrs. Vasquez said quietly, they came to my house yesterday, 3 men in suits. They said I should move somewhere safer, that the neighborhood was changing. Tank felt his anger building as Mrs. Vasquez described the visit. The men had been polite, but clear. Elderly residents were no longer welcome in what was becoming a business district for the Torrino family's operations. Mrs. Vasquez, did they threaten you directly? She shook her head, but her expression indicated that the threat had been implicit rather than stated. Detective, they offered to buy my house for twice what it's worth, but they made it clear that selling wasn't really optional. Mrs. Vasquez handed Tank the manila envelope. I've been keeping track of the changes in the neighborhood. License plate numbers, times when different people come and go, businesses that have closed and reopened. I thought maybe it would help. Tank opened the envelope and found detailed notes spanning 6 months, documenting the systematic transformation of the neighborhood. Mrs. Vasquez had created what amounted to a surveillance report on the Torrino family's operations, complete with photographs and documented patterns of activity. Mrs. Vasquez, this is incredible work. You've documented things that would take our detectives weeks to uncover. She smiled sadly. Detective, I've lived here my whole adult life. I've watched children grow up, seen families build businesses, been part of a real community. What's happening now? It's like watching everything I've known disappear. Tank studied the documentation Mrs. Vasquez had compiled, recognizing patterns that confirmed his suspicions about the scope of the Torrino family's operations. More importantly, her record provided evidence that could potentially support criminal charges if he could find a way to pursue them officially. Mrs. Vasquez, I want you to know that I'm going to do everything possible to address this situation, but I need you to be very careful. If the Torrino family realizes you've been documenting their activities, she nodded, understanding the implications. Detective, I'm 73 years old. I've survived a lot of changes in this neighborhood, but I won't be intimidated out of my own home by criminals. Tank left Mrs. Vasquez's house with renewed determination, but also with a clear understanding of the constraints he faced. The evidence she had provided was valuable, but pursuing it through official channels would require resources and support that the department wasn't prepared to provide. That evening, Tank sat in his apartment reviewing Mrs. Vasquez's documentation alongside his own case files on the Torrino family. The pattern was clear. Systematic intimidation designed to clear legitimate residents and businesses from an area that the crime family wanted control completely. The phone call that changed everything came at 11:30 p.m. Detective Rodriguez. The voice was barely a whisper. "This is Officer Martinez from the 14th. I'm calling from my personal phone. We've got a situation." Tank recognized Martinez as a young patrol officer who had been working the night shift in the neighborhood where the Torrino family was most active. "What's the situation, Martinez?" "Sir, I responded to a call about shots fired on Maple Street. When I got there, I found Mrs. Vasquez's house. Detective, they firebombed her house. She's alive, but barely. She's at City General in critical condition." Tank felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. Mrs. Vasquez had been targeted because she had dared to document the Torrino family's activities and share that information with police. "Martinez, what's the official report going to say?" The young officer's hesitation told Tank everything he needed to know. "Sir, the fire department is calling it an electrical fire. Faulty wiring in an old house." Tank understood. Someone had decided that investigating the attack on Mrs. Vasquez would create more problems than it would solve. That's when Tank made the decision that would define the rest of his career and either save his community or get him killed. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out the thick file he had been compiling on the Torrino family for over a year. Then he reached for his phone and began making calls to contacts he had developed during 15 years of police work. People who owed him favors, who shared his commitment to justice, or who had their own reasons for wanting to see organized crime eliminated from their city. Because sometimes when the system fails, one person has to become the system. Tank's first call was to Detective Maria Santos from the State Police Organized Crime Task Force. Someone he had worked with on previous investigations before budget cuts had eliminated most interagency cooperation. "Maria, it's Tank Rodriguez from the 14th. I know it's late, but I need to talk to you about the Torrino family." Santos had been investigating organized crime for 12 years and understood immediately that Tank wasn't making a social call at midnight. "Tank, what's happened?" Tank outlined the attack on Mrs. Vasquez and the department's apparent decision to treat it as an accident rather than investigate it as organized crime retaliation. "Maria, I've got documentation that could support federal racketeering charges, but I need someone with authority to pursue them. My department has decided this isn't worth the resources." Santos was quiet for a long moment. "Tank, you know I'd love to help, but the state task force has been reduced to 2 detectives covering organized crime for the entire region. We don't have the manpower for a full investigation." Tank had expected this response, but he had also prepared for it. "Maria, what if I could provide you with enough documented evidence to support a federal case? Would that change the resource equation?" "Tank, are you talking about going after the Torrino family independently? Because that's not just dangerous, it's potentially illegal if you're conducting unauthorized investigations." Tank looked at the files spread across his kitchen table, including Mrs. Vasquez's meticulous documentation and his own casework. "Maria, I'm talking about doing police work that my department has decided not to pursue. Everything I do will be legal and properly documented." Santos understood the distinction. Tank wasn't proposing vigilante justice, but rather independent investigation that could potentially be turned over to authorities who were willing to act on it. "Tank, if you can develop admissible evidence of federal crimes, I can present it to the FBI's organized crime unit. But you need to understand that you'll be operating without backup or official support." Tank's second call was to Sergeant Mike Bulldog Chun from the Narcotics Division, a 20-year veteran who had been frustrated by his own department's reluctance to pursue major drug trafficking organizations. "Bulldog, it's Tank. I need to ask you about something off the record." Chun had worked with Tank on several cases and trusted his judgment. "What do you need, Tank?" "The Torrino family is moving serious quantities of drugs through the neighborhood, But narcotics enforcement seems to be focused on street-level dealers rather than the organization that's supplying them. Chen's response indicated that Tank had identified a sore point. Tank, you're right, but going after organized distribution requires long-term surveillance and undercover work that we don't have resources for. We're hitting the dealers we can catch, but the supply keeps coming. Tank had anticipated this conversation as well. Bulldog, what if I told you I could provide intelligence on the Torrino family's distribution network? Locations times key personnel? Tank, how could you possibly have that kind of intelligence? Tank smiled grimly. Because I've been watching them for over a year, and I've got community sources who've been documenting everything. Chun was interested despite his concerns. Tank, that kind of intelligence could support major seizures and arrests, but it would require coordination between multiple agencies. Tank's third call was to FBI Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, someone he had met during a joint task force operation 2 years earlier. Agent Walsh, this is Detective Rodriguez from the 14th Precinct. I work with you on the Martinez kidnapping case. Walsh remembered him immediately. Detective Rodriguez, what can I do for you? Tank explained the situation with the Torrino family and the local department's reluctance to pursue organized crime investigations. Agent Walsh, I believe I could develop evidence of federal crimes, including racketeering, drug trafficking, and conspiracy. But I need to know if the FBI would be interested in pursuing such a case. Walsh's response was cautious, but interested. Detective, the FBI is always interested in organized crime cases, but we need substantial evidence before we can commit resources to an investigation. Tank had saved his most important call for last. Attorney Rebecca Stone ran a nonprofit law firm that specialized in prosecuting civil rights violations and government corruption. Ms. Stone, this is Detective David Rodriguez. I need to consult with you about police corruption and organized crime. Stone had built her reputation by taking cases that other attorneys wouldn't touch, particularly those involving official misconduct and institutional failure. Detective Rodriguez, what kind of consultation are you looking for? Tank explained how his department had decided not to investigate obvious organized crime activities, and had classified the attack on Mrs. Vasquez as an accident rather than retaliation. Ms. Stone, I believe my department has been compromised either through corruption or intimidation. I want to pursue this case independently, but I need legal guidance to ensure everything I do is admissible in court. Stone's interest was immediate. Detective, are you prepared to document official misconduct as part of your investigation? Tank looked at the evidence file surrounding him. Ms. Stone, I'm prepared to document everything. Over the following week, Tank coordinated with his network of contacts to develop a comprehensive investigation plan that would operate independently of his department while remaining legally sound and professionally ethical. Maria Santos provided guidance on federal racketeering statutes and evidence requirements. Mike Chin shared intelligence on drug trafficking patterns that correlated with Tank's observations of Torrino family activities. Jennifer Walsh outlined FBI procedures for evaluating organized crime cases. Rebecca Stone provided legal framework for conducting independent investigations while maintaining admissibility of evidence. Tank's investigation began with surveillance operations conducted during his off-duty hours, using Mrs. Vasquez's documentation as a starting point for identifying patterns and key personnel in the Torrino family's operations. Working alone but coordinating with his network of professional contacts, Tank began building a case that would either bring down one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the city's history or result in his own destruction. The war had begun, and Tank was fighting it one piece of evidence at a time. 2 weeks into his independent investigation, Tank had documented enough criminal activity to support federal charges against 17 members of the Torrino family organization. His surveillance had identified drug distribution centers, money laundering operations, and extortion schemes that generated millions of dollars in illegal revenue. But the Torrino family had also begun to notice that someone was watching them. Tank was reviewing surveillance photographs in his apartment when his phone rang at 2 a.m. Detective Rodriguez. The voice was electronically disguised. You should know that your activities have been noticed. Continuing your investigation would be bad for your health. Tank's response was immediate and clear. If you want to threaten me, Do it in person. I'm not hard to find." The caller hung up, but Tank understood that the stakes had just escalated significantly. The next morning, Tank found 4 slashed tires on his personal vehicle and a note tucked under his windshield wiper. Final warning. That afternoon, Tank made a decision that would bring his investigation to its climax. He called Vincent Torrino's social club and asked to speak with the boss directly. "Mr. Torrino, this is Detective David Rodriguez. I think we should meet." The conversation that followed would determine whether Tank's war against organized crime would end in victory or defeat. The meeting was arranged for 7 p.m. at Torrino's social club, a nondescript building that served as the family's unofficial headquarters. Tank arrived alone as requested, but he wasn't unprepared. Hidden recording devices, backup documentation stored in multiple locations, and a network of contacts who knew exactly where he was and what he was attempting to accomplish. Vincent Vinny the Fish, Torrino was younger than Tank had expected, maybe 40 years old, wearing an expensive suit that probably cost more than Tank made in a month. But his eyes carried the cold calculation that Tank recognized in career criminals who had grown up in an environment where violence was just another business tool. "Detective Rodriguez," Torrino said, gesturing for Tank to sit across from him at a small table in the club's back room. "I understand you've been taking an interest in my family's activities." Tank settled into his chair, noting the 2 large men positioned near the room's exits and the subtle bulges under their jackets that indicated concealed weapons. "Mr. Torrino, I've been investigating criminal activities in my precinct. Some of those activities appear to involve your organization." Torrino smiled, but the expression carried no warmth. "Detective, I think there's been a misunderstanding. My family operates legitimate businesses. We're productive members of the community." Tank placed a manila folder on the table between them. "Mr. Torrino, I have documented evidence of drug trafficking, money laundering, extortion, and conspiracy to commit murder, all connected to businesses that you either own or control." Torrino's smile faded as he opened the folder and began reviewing contents. Tank watched his expression change from condescending amusement to genuine concern as he realized the scope and detail of the evidence Tank had compiled. "This is impressive work, Detective," Torrino said finally. "Very thorough, very professional." Tank waited, understanding that Torrino was evaluating his options and deciding how to respond to the threat that Tank's investigation represented. "Detective Rodriguez, I'm going to make you an offer. A generous offer that recognizes your obvious talents and dedication." Tank had expected this approach. "I'm listening." Torrino leaned forward slightly. "Join my organization. Your skills will be valuable to us, and the compensation would be significantly better than what the city pays its detectives." Tank's response was immediate. "Mr. Torrino, I'm a police officer. I took an oath to uphold the law, not break it." Torrino nodded as if he had expected this answer. "Detective, that's admirable. Truly. But I need you to understand something about the reality of your situation." He gestured toward one of his men, who placed several photographs on the table. Tank recognized images of himself entering his apartment, shopping at the grocery store, visiting Mrs. Vasquez at the hospital. "Detective Rodriguez, we know where you live, where you shop, where you eat, who you talk to. We know that you're conducting this investigation independently, without official department support." Tank studied the photographs, understanding the implicit threat, but not allowing any emotion to show in his expression. "Mr. Torrino, if you're threatening me, you should know that I've documented everything about this investigation. If something happens to me, all of that documentation goes to federal authorities." Torrino's expression shifted to genuine respect. "Detective, I believe you. You're obviously not someone who operates without contingency plans." He leaned back in his chair, clearly reconsidering his approach. "Detective Rodriguez, let me ask you something. What do you think will happen if you succeed in your investigation? If you somehow manage to arrest members of my organization and disrupt our operations?" Tank had considered this question extensively. Justice will be served. Criminals will be held accountable for their actions. Torrino shook his head. "Detective, what will happen is that another organization will move in to fill the vacuum we leave behind. Probably the Russians or the Colombians. organizations that are far more violent and far less reasonable than my family. Tank had heard this argument before from criminals who portrayed themselves as a lesser evil compared to theoretical alternatives. Mr. Torrino, that's not my concern. My job is to enforce a law against the criminals who are operating in my jurisdiction now. Torrino studied Tank for a long moment, clearly trying to assess his determination and flexibility. Detective Rodriguez, I'm going to make you one final offer. Take a transfer to another precinct. Take a promotion that gets you out of organized crime investigation. Take a comfortable assignment that doesn't interfere with my family's business. Tank gathered the photographs and placed them back in his folder. Mr. Torrino, I'm not leaving my precinct, and I'm not abandoning my investigation. Torrino's expression hardened. Detective, you need to understand that my organization has resources you can't match. Lawyers, money, political connections, and other capabilities that can make your life very difficult. Tank stood up, preparing to leave. Mr. Torrino, you need to understand that I have something your organization can't buy or intimidate. Integrity. As Tank walked toward the exit, Torrino spoke one final time. Detective Rodriguez, this conversation never happened. But the next time we meet, the circumstances will be very different. Tank paused at the door. Mr. Torrino, the next time we meet, you'll be in handcuffs. Tank left the social club knowing that he had just declared war on one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in the city. But he also knew that he had successfully documented Torrino's implicit admission of criminal activity and his attempt at bribery and intimidation. The recording devices had captured everything. 3 days later, Tank coordinated simultaneous raids on 7 Torrino family operations, supported by federal agents and state police who had been convinced by the evidence Tank had developed independently. Vincent Torrino was arrested at his social club, along with 23 members of his organization. The charges included racketeering, drug trafficking, money laundering, conspiracy, and attempted bribery of a police officer. Tank testified before a federal grand jury, presenting evidence that had been gathered through months of independent investigation conducted without official department support. The trial that followed would establish Tank as one of the most effective organized crime investigators in the region's history, but more importantly, it would demonstrate that sometimes one person with unwavering integrity can accomplish what entire institutions cannot. The graffiti message that claimed, "This city belongs to U.S. now," was painted over by community volunteers a day after Torrino's arrest. In its place, someone had written, "This city belongs to everyone." Mrs. Vasquez recovered from her injuries and returned to her home on Maple Street, where legitimate businesses began reopening as the Torrino family's intimidation network collapsed. Tank returned to his regular duties at the 14th precinct, but his reputation as a detective who had single-handedly dismantled organized crime in his neighborhood attracted attention from law enforcement agencies throughout the country. 6 months later, Tank received an offer to join the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force, where his experience conducting independent investigations will be valuable for future cases. But Tank declined the offer, choosing instead to remain at the 14th precinct, where he could continue serving the community that had supported his fight against the Torrino family. "This is where I belong," Tank explained to Captain Mills. "This is where the work matters most." The detective they called Tank had proven that sometimes one person's refusal to accept injustice can change everything, and that integrity is the most powerful weapon in the fight against corruption. Have you ever witnessed someone who refused to back down in the face of overwhelming odds? David Tank Rodriguez represents the kind of courage that doesn't compromise, doesn't negotiate with evil, and doesn't accept that this is just how things are. Subscribe to Those Who Left a Trace if you believe that one person can make a difference, and that standing up for what's right is always worth the risk. We'll see you in the next story, where we'll continue to honor those who prove that integrity and determination can overcome any obstacle, no matter how powerful or dangerous it might seem.